It was the kind of summer day that felt like it could go on forever. The air was warm but soft. The smell of grass and old wood filled the air, and somewhere in the distance you could hear the hum of cicadas. The Miller family had gathered at the old farmhouse like they did every year, bringing coolers of food, folding chairs, and the kind of laughter that only comes from family who know each other too well. The farmhouse had been in the family for generations, sitting on the edge of a small Indiana town where the fields stretched out endlessly. It wasn't fancy, but it had a charm that drew everyone back. Its creaky porch, the big oak tree out front, and the wide backyard that seemed made for children to run wild in. That afternoon, the grown-ups were busy inside, setting the table for dinner, while the kids played outside. Among them was 8-year-old Ethan Miller. He was small for his age, with sandy brown hair that always stuck up in odd directions and a grin that could win anyone over. Ethan was the kind of kid who loved being outdoors. He'd spend hours looking for frogs by the pond or climbing trees just to see how far he could get before his mother called him down. He was the youngest among his cousins, and they all adored him. He had that mix of innocence and curiosity that made him fun to be around. His cousin Jake, who was 12, often looked out for him, but Ethan never wanted special treatment. He wanted to keep up, to be part of every adventure. That evening, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the cousins decided to play a game of hide-and-seek before dinner. It was a tradition every summer. Someone would count by the old barn while the rest ran off to find the best hiding spots around the property. The rule was simple. Anywhere outside was fair game, but you couldn't go inside the house. Jake volunteered to be it first, and as he began to count, the rest of the kids scattered in all directions. Ethan ran toward the back of the property, giggling as he looked for the perfect spot. He thought about hiding behind the chicken coop, but that was too easy. Maybe behind the old tractor? No, he'd been found there last time. He wanted a spot so good that no one would ever think to look. That's when he noticed the small opening near the side of the barn. It was half hidden by tall weeds and an old wooden board that looked like it had fallen long ago. To Ethan, it looked like a secret place, maybe a tunnel or an old drain. The kind of hiding spot that could win him the game for sure. He crouched down and peered inside. It was dark, but not too dark. The space looked big enough for him to crawl into, and the cool air coming out of it felt nice against the summer heat. Without thinking twice, he slipped inside, trying not to make a sound. From the yard, Jake shouted, "Ready or not, here I come." The game was on. One by one, he found the others, behind trees under the porch, even up in the branches of the oak tree. Each time he tagged someone, there was laughter and shouting. But after everyone had been found, one person was still missing. "Where's Ethan?" Jake called out, looking around. "He's probably hiding again," one of the cousins said, rolling her eyes. "He always takes it too seriously." The group began to search again, laughing at first, calling his name like it was part of the game. But after a few minutes, the laughter started to fade. The sun was slipping lower, painting the sky orange and pink. Ethan still hadn't come out. Jake walked toward the back of the property where he last saw Ethan running. He checked behind the shed, then by the fence, then even under the old truck that hadn't run in years. Nothing. The others joined in, spreading out across the yard, calling louder now. "Ethan, game's over. Come out!" Still no answer. When the children finally went inside and told the adults that Ethan wasn't coming out, his mother at first thought he was being stubborn. He loved to win, and maybe he was hiding just to get attention. But when 10 more minutes passed and there was still no sign of him, she felt something cold settle in her chest. "George," she said quietly to her husband. "He's not answering." Within moments, everyone was outside, parents, aunts, uncles, even the grandparents. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone. Flashlights came out. The older cousins ran down the dirt road calling his name. His mother's voice grew more frantic each time she shouted it. "Ethan! Sweetheart, it's time for dinner. Come on, honey." But only the sound of crickets answered. By nightfall, panic had set in. They called the local sheriff, who arrived with a small team of deputies and a search dog. Neighbors showed up to help, carrying lanterns and walking sticks. The fields were searched first, then the woods. They checked every shed, every fence, even the old well that had been sealed years ago. Hours turned into an endless night. Ethan's mother refused to go inside. She stood by the porch, eyes fixed on the darkness, whispering his name over and over as if he might somehow hear her and come running out from the shadows. The search continued until dawn. When the first light of morning touched the fields, the sheriff walked up to the family, his face tired and drawn. "We haven't found anything," he said softly, "but we're not stopping." For the next week, the search grew bigger. Volunteers from nearby towns came to help. Flyers with Ethan's picture were printed and posted everywhere: the grocery store, the post office, telephone poles along the main road. The media got involved, and soon the story of the missing boy in Indiana was on every local station. Helicopters flew over the farmland. Divers checked the nearby river. The police brought in dogs that could pick up scent trails. But no matter how many times they searched, it was like Ethan had simply vanished into thin air. There were rumors, as there always are. Some said maybe he'd been taken. Others whispered that he'd wandered off and gotten lost in the woods. But nothing made sense. He was just playing a game in his grandparents' backyard. How could he be gone? The Miller family clung to each other in those first awful weeks. Ethan's mother barely slept, and his father spent every waking moment walking the property with a flashlight, even in daylight. "I just need to look one more time," he'd say. Neighbors brought food, but no one felt like eating. Every sound, the creak of the barn, the rustle of wind in the trees, felt like it could be him. Every day that passed without an answer made the silence heavier. Eventually, the search teams packed up. The sheriff told the family they would keep the case open, but there was nothing more they could do for now. That sentence, "for now," echoed through the house like a curse. Summer faded into fall and the farmhouse grew quiet again. The toys Ethan had left scattered around the yard stayed where they were for weeks until rain washed them into the dirt. His shoes were still by the back door. His drawing still hung on the refrigerator. At night, his mother would leave the porch light on just in case. She'd sit by the window long after everyone else had gone to bed, watching the empty fields, waiting for some movement, some sign. She believed with every part of her heart that he was still out there somewhere, but deep down, the family knew the truth that no one wanted to say aloud. Ethan wasn't coming home. The farmhouse never felt the same after that summer. The laughter of cousins playing outside was replaced by silence. The annual family gathering stopped. Everyone seemed to carry a piece of guilt, wondering if there was something they could have done differently that day. Jake, the cousin who had been it, grew up haunted by that game. He replayed it in his head for years, every place he looked, every sound he heard. He remembered seeing Ethan run toward the back of the property, but couldn't remember exactly where he went. That missing detail would follow him for decades, and so the story of Ethan Miller became part of local memory. People in town still mentioned him sometimes when they passed the farmhouse. Kids whispered about it at school, saying his ghost might still be hiding somewhere on the property, waiting for someone to find him. But for the Miller family, it wasn't a story. It was a wound that never healed. The farmhouse eventually fell quiet, then empty. The grass grew tall around the barn. Seasons came and went, and though the world kept moving for Ethan's family, time seemed to stop on that one summer evening when a simple game of hide-and-seek turned into a lifetime of questions. No one could have known then that the truth wasn't lost forever. It was waiting, hidden just beneath the surface where no one had thought to look. The weeks turned into months, and the Miller family's world had completely changed. The farmhouse that was once full of laughter and the sound of children running across the yard now felt empty. The air inside was heavy, like the house itself had gone silent in grief. The dining table still had the same old checkered cloth, but the chairs were often left untouched. No one talked much anymore. The sound of the screen door creaking open no longer meant someone was coming in with a smile. It usually meant someone was leaving to escape the silence for a while. Ethan's mother, Linda, spent most mornings sitting by the window that faced the yard. She used to love that view. The sunlight on the grass, the barn glowing gold in the evenings. Now she could barely look at it without her chest tightening. Every time the wind rustled the tall grass, she thought for a moment she heard footsteps. Sometimes she'd whisper his name softly, as if the wind might carry it to him wherever he was. His father, George, coped differently. He threw himself into work, spending long hours at the small auto shop he owned in town. It was the only thing that distracted him from the constant ache in his chest. But even there, people would look at him with quiet sympathy. They meant well, but the pity in their eyes made him feel worse. He hated being the man whose boy went missing. At home, the family tried to live as normal as possible, though nothing about life felt normal anymore. Linda kept Ethan's room exactly as he left it. His toys were lined up neatly on the shelf, and his baseball cap still hung on the bedpost. Every night before bed, she'd walk in, smooth the blanket on his bed, and whisper goodnight like she always had. It was a small ritual, a way to hold on to something that still felt like love, even in the middle of all that loss. Jake, the cousin who had been counting during the game that night, carried his own kind of guilt. He was 12 then, old enough to remember every detail and young enough to feel powerless to change anything. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, how he turned around after counting, how he laughed, how sure he was that Ethan was hiding somewhere nearby. He'd been the one calling out his name when they realized something was wrong, and that memory stayed with him through his teenage years and into adulthood. He often visited the farmhouse with his parents in the months that followed. He'd walk around the yard, retracing steps, checking behind the same sheds and fences, even when he knew there was nothing to find. Sometimes he'd just sit on the porch steps and stare at the field, as if by doing that long enough the answer might appear. Winter came early that year, covering the farmland in snow. For most people, winter meant cozy nights and warm fires. For the Millers, it meant another season without answers. The holidays, once a time for family dinners and noisy laughter, became something they quietly endured. When they decorated the tree that December, Linda placed a small ornament with Ethan's picture near the top. No one spoke while she did it, but everyone felt it, the emptiness where his laughter should have been. As the years passed, the missing posters faded, but the hope never fully disappeared. Linda refused to believe that her son was gone forever. She held on to the idea that maybe he'd been taken, that maybe one day someone would knock on the door and he'd be standing there, grown but safe. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it kept her moving. She began volunteering with a local group that helped families of missing children. She would sit with mothers who were just starting their own nightmare and tell them that it was okay to hold on, but also okay to cry. People often said she was strong, but she didn't feel that way. She just didn't know how to give up. George, on the other hand, became quieter as the years went on. He didn't like to talk about it. Every once in a while, he'd take his truck and drive out to the farmhouse even after they'd moved into town. He'd stand by the barn and just look around. Sometimes he'd find old toys half buried in the dirt, a toy car, a broken slingshot, and he'd take them home and keep them in a box in his closet. He never told Linda about that box. It was his own way of remembering. Jake grew up and moved to another state for college, but the memory of that summer never left him. In his dorm room, he kept a small photo of the cousins lined up on the farmhouse porch, all smiling. Every time he looked at it, he saw Ethan in the front, grinning, unaware that it would be the last picture they'd ever take together. Whenever Jake came home for the holidays, he'd visit Linda and George. The conversations were polite at first and about work, about the weather, but they always ended the same way. Someone would bring up Ethan. The air would grow heavy and the room would fall silent. After all these years, there were still no answers. The police had followed every lead, but none of them led anywhere. There were moments when the family almost moved on. They'd have a barbecue, or someone would tell a funny story from the old days, and for a few minutes it would feel like the shadow had lifted. But it never lasted long. It was as if grief had built a permanent home with them. Time has a strange way of moving when you're waiting for something that might never come. The days blend together. Years go by, and you start to measure time not by birthdays or holidays, but by anniversaries of loss every summer. On the anniversary of the day Ethan disappeared, the family gathered at the farmhouse. Even when it was sold years later, they were allowed to visit. They would stand near the oak tree, say a prayer, and release a balloon into the sky. It became a ritual, quiet, private, and full of emotion. Linda always chose a yellow balloon, saying it was the color that reminded her of her son's smile. As the decades went by, the farmhouse aged. Paint peeled from the siding, the porch began to sag, and weeds grew taller each year. The barn, once full of tools and hay, now stood mostly empty, its wood darkened by time. The town itself changed too. New families moved in, new businesses opened, and people who had once searched side by side for Ethan grew older or moved away. But even as the world moved on, there were people who still remembered. The story of the missing boy became a quiet piece of local history, something parents whispered to their children when warning them not to wander too far from home. For Linda and George, life continued in the slow, heavy way that grief allows. They never stopped looking for answers, though their search grew gentler with age. Linda still kept Ethan's room the same. His drawings were faded, but they stayed on the walls. His small shoes sat neatly in the closet, untouched. She said that as long as his room stayed ready, he'd have a place to come back to. George, whose hair had turned gray and face lined with years of worry, often sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset the way Ethan used to. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke enough. Then came a day many years later when something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from the county office. The farmhouse, which had been sold years earlier, was going to be restored by its new owners. The land had been neglected for too long, and the county planned to bring it back to life. Linda read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't been back there in a long time, but something in her heart told her that maybe, just maybe, this would bring some kind of closure. She didn't know what she expected. She only knew that the place still held pieces of her son's story, and she wanted to see it again. When she mentioned the news to Jake, now in his 40s, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The farmhouse had haunted his dreams for years, but the idea of it being restored made him feel hopeful. Maybe the past could finally breathe again. He offered to drive out there with her once the work began. "It's just a house," he said softly, "but maybe it's time we go back." Linda nodded. She didn't say much, but her eyes said everything. What none of them knew was that the letter marked the beginning of something bigger, something that would finally bring the answers they had been waiting for. The truth had been buried for decades right beneath their feet, hidden where no one had ever thought to look. But before the truth came, there was still one more chapter of waiting. 32 long years of wondering, remembering and holding on to a love that refused to fade. And somewhere, deep under the ground near that old barn, the secret of what really happened that summer night waited patiently to be found. It was early spring when the old Miller farmhouse came back to life. The new owners were a young couple who wanted to restore it and turn the land into a small family farm again. They didn't know much about its past, just that it had been empty for years and needed a lot of work. To them, it was a project, a dream of quiet living. To the Miller family, it was sacred ground. The first time Linda heard the sound of machines rumbling on the property, she felt a strange pull in her chest. She hadn't been there in more than 2 decades, but something about knowing people were digging up the earth again made her uneasy. Still, she told herself that maybe it was a good thing. Maybe it was time for the land to wake up. Jake called her one morning. "They started clearing around the barn," he said. "Do you want to go see it?" There was a pause on the line. Then Linda said softly, "Yes, I think I should." When they arrived that afternoon, the place looked both familiar and strange. The porch was being repaired, the windows replaced. The big oak tree still stood tall, its branches spreading wide like a guardian watching over everything. But the barn, that old red barn that had once echoed with laughter, looked smaller now. Its paint was faded, its doors half open, and piles of dirt surrounded it where workers had begun to dig near the foundation. Linda stood there quietly, taking it all in. The air smelled of fresh soil and wood dust. Memories came rushing back. The sound of Ethan's laughter, the way his shoes used to crunch on the gravel, the call of his cousins as they ran around playing. It was all there, hiding under the noise of construction. One of the workers noticed them and walked over. "You must be the family," he said kindly. "We found a few old things around here. Bottles, pieces of wood, even a small toy car." At the word toy, Linda's breath caught for a second. "A toy car?" she repeated. "Yeah," the man said, pulling it from his pocket. "It's a little rusty, but you can still see the blue paint." She took it gently in her hands. It was small and worn, the wheels barely hanging on. She remembered that toy. It had been one of Ethan's favorites. He used to carry it in his pocket wherever he went. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Jake stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I guess he must have dropped it here when he was playing," the worker said, not realizing the weight of what he'd just said. Linda smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "He must have." That night, she couldn't stop thinking about that toy car. She placed it on her nightstand beside Ethan's picture and stared at it for a long time. It felt like a small sign, something reaching across the years to remind her that her little boy had once been there, happy and full of life. A week later, The workers returned to finish digging near the barn. They were clearing an old concrete area that had cracked and sunk over time. The plan was to remove it and pour a new foundation. The crew used shovels to loosen the edges, then brought in small machinery to break apart the concrete. It was a normal day, sunny, quiet routine, until one of the men noticed something strange beneath the broken layer, a hollow sound. He tapped again and realized there was a space underneath. "Hey, there's something here," he called out. They cleared more dirt and uncovered a square opening covered with a rusted metal sheet, sealed over long ago. It looked like some kind of old storm drain or access tunnel. The metal had corroded and part of it had caved in. Curious, one of the men pried the cover loose. A rush of stale air came out, cold and musty. They pointed a flashlight inside and saw what looked like a narrow passage leading several feet under the barn. It was small, barely big enough for a child to crawl through. One of the men shook his head. Probably part of the old drainage system. These farms used to have them all the time. They called the site supervisor, who decided to pause work until they could get someone from the county to inspect it. It wasn't unusual to find old structures on farmland, but the depth of this one made them cautious. When the county inspector arrived the next morning, he took a look and frowned. "This shouldn't be here," he said. According to old property maps, the storm drains were sealed decades ago. Still, he decided to go down and check. A few minutes later, his voice echoed faintly from below. "It's narrow. Looks like it runs under the barn. There's debris." "Wait, hold on." The next words came out quieter. "You might want to call the sheriff's office." The workers exchanged uneasy looks. They didn't ask questions, but everyone knew what that meant. By noon, the area was taped off and 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled up. The local news caught wind of it and sent a reporter, but they were kept at a distance. The sheriff spoke with the inspector, then climbed down himself. When he came back up, his face was pale. "We'll need to run some tests," he said. "But it looks like we may have found human remains." The word spread through town within hours. Jake got the call first. His voice trembled when he answered. "What did you say?" The officer on the line spoke carefully. "We're not certain yet. We'll need to confirm." But the discovery was made on the old Miller property. Jake sat in silence for a long moment. Then he whispered, "I'll tell her." Linda was in the garden when he arrived. She looked up and saw his face, pale and tight. "Jake, what is it?" she asked. He hesitated. "They found something at the farmhouse." Her hands stopped moving. "Something?" "They're not sure yet," he said quietly. "But they think it might be him." The world seemed to slow around her. The sound of birds faded, the air grew still. For 32 years she had dreamed of hearing news about her son. But hearing it now in this way made her heart ache in a way she couldn't describe. That evening they drove to the site together. The area around the barn was surrounded by police tape, and floodlights illuminated the ground. Officers were working carefully, collecting soil samples, taking photographs. Linda stood a few feet away, clutching Jake's arm. The sheriff approached her gently. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "I'm very sorry for the circumstances. We've recovered what appeared to be skeletal remains. We can't make any statements until the lab confirms, but we wanted to let you know first." Her voice shook. "Was it under the barn?" "Yes, ma'am. In what seems to be a sealed storm drain. It must have been closed off years ago. We wouldn't have known it was there." She nodded slowly, trying to take it in. "Can you tell how long it's been there?" He hesitated. "A very long time." The drive home was silent. Linda stared out the window, her thoughts drifting back to that summer night when her boy ran off laughing, believing he'd found the perfect hiding spot. Over the next few days, the county lab worked quickly. The results came back within a week. The remains were confirmed to belong to Ethan Miller. When the call came, Linda didn't cry at first. She just sat down, holding the phone to her ear, and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't relief exactly. It was something deeper, something between grief and peace. The not knowing had been the hardest part. Now finally she knew. Jake came over that evening. They sat on the porch together as the sun went down, the toy car between them on the table. "All this time," he said softly. "He was right there." Linda nodded, her eyes distant. "Just a few yards from where we were calling his name." The news spread quickly through town again. Reporters came, neighbors stopped by, and people brought flowers. There were tears, of course, but also a strange, quiet relief among everyone who had known the story all those years. The mystery that had haunted the town for decades finally had an ending. Investigators later pieced together what likely happened. The storm drain had once been part of the barn's old water system, used for runoff during heavy rains. It had been partially collapsed even before the 1990s, and when Ethan crawled inside to hide, the loose soil around it might have shifted. A few weeks after his disappearance, construction on the property had sealed the drain completely without anyone realizing it was there. It was a heartbreaking accident, one no one could have predicted or prevented once it happened. When the investigation closed, the sheriff personally returned Ethan's small belongings to the family, a piece of fabric from his shirt, and the little blue toy car that had been found earlier. Linda placed them gently in a small wooden box and set it on the mantel. She didn't see it as a box of sadness anymore. To her, it was proof that her son had existed, that his laughter had once filled the air, that his story, though tragic, had finally found its ending. As she stood by the window that night, she whispered softly, "You're home now." And outside, under the starlit sky, the wind moved through the trees in the same soft rhythm it had 32 years ago, as if carrying that message out across the fields. A mother's final call answered at last. After the confirmation came, everything felt strangely quiet. For 32 years, the Miller family had lived with uncertainty, and now that the truth had finally come out, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy, painful silence of waiting. It was a softer kind, one that carried both sadness and peace. Linda sat at the kitchen table the morning after the sheriff's call. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her, growing cold. She stared out the window where the first light of dawn spread across the town. The sky looked exactly the way it had that morning so many years ago, when the search teams were out in the fields calling her son's name. Jake arrived just after sunrise. He didn't say much when he came in, just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been felt in their hearts. Finally, Linda broke the silence. "You know," she said quietly, "all these years I thought someone had taken him. I used to imagine every possibility. I thought maybe he was living somewhere. Maybe he didn't remember us. But I never once thought he was right there." Jake nodded slowly. "None of us did." He ran his hand over his face, his eyes tired. "When we were kids, I used to go over that night again and again in my head. I thought if I remembered enough, I'd figure it out. But I never looked by that barn. I just never thought to." Linda reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "You were just a boy," she said softly. "None of us could have known. We were all looking in the wrong direction." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, gentle but steady, carrying the smell of early spring. Somewhere a bird began to sing. Life was still moving forward, even though the past had just caught up with them. Later that day, the sheriff stopped by the house to explain what the investigation had uncovered. He was kind, taking his time to answer every question. "We went through the old records," he said. "Turns out the barn had a storm drain that connected to a runoff system built in the 1950s. It wasn't on any of the newer property maps. When the barn floor was repaired years later, that drain got sealed over. We found signs of collapse in the soil near where the remains were found. It looks like the opening caved in while he was inside." Linda listened quietly. The words were heavy, but there was comfort in knowing what had really happened. "So it was an accident," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Yes, ma'am," the sheriff replied. "A terrible accident. There was no sign of foul play, no sign anyone else was involved. It's likely he crawled in during the game and couldn't get out." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, picturing her little boy that summer evening, laughing, running barefoot through the yard, trying to find the perfect hiding place. He must have thought he'd found it. The thought made her heart ache, but it also gave her a strange peace. He hadn't been taken. He hadn't suffered at the hands of someone cruel. He had simply been a child playing. After the sheriff left, she sat for a long time on the porch watching the light change across the fields. Jake joined her after a while. They sat side by side, saying nothing, just listening to the wind and the faint hum of cars from the road. Finally, Jake spoke. "Do you think knowing makes it easier?" Linda thought for a long moment before answering. "I think knowing makes it real," she said. And real is something I can live with. In the days that followed, people from the community reached out. Neighbors brought flowers, letters, and even old photographs from when the kids used to play together. Some of them cried with her, others just held her hand. The story spread quickly again. The mystery that had lingered for so many years had finally been solved. Reporters called, asking for interviews, but Linda turned them all down. She didn't want the story to be about tragedy or headlines. She wanted it to stay what it truly was, a story about family, love, and a little boy who never made it home. A week later, the family held a small memorial at the farmhouse. The new owners were kind enough to let them use the property for the day. The barn had been cleaned up and a gentle breeze moved through the open fields. The sun was warm and the sky was clear, almost identical to that summer day long ago. Family and friends gathered quietly. There was no grand speech, no big ceremony, just a circle of people holding hands and remembering. Linda stood near the oak tree where the children had once played. She held a small wooden box that contained Ethan's remains. Her voice trembled a little as she spoke. "For so many years I didn't know where you were," she said softly, her words drifting into the wind. "But now I do. You were here all along. You never left us." Jake stepped forward and placed the small blue toy car beside the box. He smiled faintly through his tears. "You finally won the game, little man," he said quietly. "We just took too long to find you." There were tears all around, but there was also something else, and a quiet warmth, a feeling of release. For the first time in 32 years, the family could breathe again. After the service, Linda walked around the property one last time. She stopped by the barn and placed her hand on the wooden wall. The sunlight filtered through the cracks and dust floated in the air like tiny pieces of gold. She could almost hear the echo of children laughing, the sound of running feet, the joy that had once filled this place. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to anyone in particular, maybe to the land itself, maybe to her son. That night, as she sat by her window at home, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: peace. It wasn't that the pain was gone, but it no longer felt endless. The years of wondering had finally come to an end. Jake visited her often after that. They would sit on the porch and talk about small things: the weather, work, old memories. Sometimes they talked about Ethan, but now it felt easier. It felt like remembering, not hurting. One afternoon, Jake brought a box of old family photos. They spent hours looking through them. Birthdays, holidays, the cousins lined up on the farmhouse steps. When they found the picture of Ethan holding the toy car, both of them smiled. "He really loved that car," Jake said. "He did," Linda replied softly. "He used to make it race across the floor and laugh when it crashed into the wall." She placed the photo on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "You know, I used to think that losing him broke me," she said. "But now I see that loving him kept me alive. That's what carried me all these years." Jake nodded. "He'd be proud of you, Aunt Linda." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I think he'd just be glad we finally found him." As time went on, life slowly found its rhythm again. The farmhouse was restored, the fields turned green once more, and a small plaque was placed near the barn in memory of Ethan. It read simply, "Forever found, forever loved." People who passed by would sometimes stop and read it, not always knowing the story, but feeling the quiet power behind those words. For Linda, it became a place of peace. She'd visit every now and then, bringing flowers or sitting on the porch for an hour, listening to the sounds of the countryside. The place that had once been filled with pain now felt gentle, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Jake, too, found healing. He often thought about how one moment, one innocent game, had shaped their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. But he also learned that closure doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding, forgiving, and letting go. Years later, when people in town spoke about the Miller farmhouse, they didn't talk about it as the place where something terrible happened. They talked about it as the place where a family found peace after decades of pain, a place that reminded everyone that even the deepest mysteries can one day find their answers. And so, the story of Ethan Miller, the boy who went missing during a game of hide-and-seek, became more than a tragedy. It became a story about love, patience, and the quiet strength of a family who never gave up hope. For Linda, every sunrise now carried a different meaning. It no longer reminded her of what she'd lost. but of what she'd finally found: the truth, the peace, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The seasons changed slowly after the memorial, and life began to settle in a way that felt almost peaceful. For the first time in more than 3 decades, there were no unanswered questions, no restless nights wondering where he had gone. The pain was still there, but it had softened into something gentler, something that could be carried instead of fought. Linda found herself visiting the old farmhouse less often as time passed, but she still thought of it every day. Sometimes, she'd be watering the flowers outside her small house and catch herself glancing toward the open sky, remembering the sound of Ethan's laughter as he ran through the fields. It no longer brought tears, at least not always. Now it brought a small, quiet smile. She had learned that grief never truly goes away. It just changes shape. It becomes a companion, one that walks beside you quietly, reminding you of both love and loss. And in that way, Ethan never really left her. Jake had started his own family by then. He lived a few towns over with a wife and 2 children of his own. On weekends, they would often visit Linda, bringing her fresh fruit, photos, and stories from their lives. His son, who was around the same age Ethan had been when he disappeared, would sometimes ask about the cousin from the photo on the shelf. Linda always answered kindly, in a way that made it a story of love instead of tragedy. "He was the bravest little boy I ever knew," she would say. "He loved to laugh, and he was always looking for the best hiding spots. One day he hid so well that it took us a very long time to find him. But we finally did." The boy would listen with wide eyes, sometimes asking if he could visit the place where Ethan had played. And so on sunny afternoons, the family would drive out to the old Miller property. The barn had been repaired and painted a soft red. The fields around it were filled with tall grass swaying in the breeze. Near the big oak tree there was a small garden now, bright flowers growing in a circle around a smooth stone plaque that read, "Forever found, forever loved." Linda would sit on the bench nearby while Jake's children ran around, laughing and playing hide-and-seek just as Ethan and his cousins once did. The sound of their laughter filled the air again, and for a moment, it was as if time had folded in on itself, as if Ethan's spirit was right there, smiling at the joy that had returned to that place. Jake often watched them with a mix of sadness and peace. "It feels right, doesn't it?" he said one day, sitting beside Linda. "Kids playing here again. Laughter where there used to be silence." Linda nodded. "It does. This place was always meant to have laughter in it." Over time, word about the family's story spread beyond their small town. People from nearby communities would sometimes stop by the plaque, leaving small notes or flowers. Many of them were parents who had lost children of their own. They would write messages of hope, of love, of how the Miller's story had given them comfort. Linda never sought attention for what happened, but she understood that the story carried meaning beyond her own family. It was a reminder that even when loss seems endless, the truth can still bring light. That closure, no matter how long it takes, has the power to heal. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail from a woman she'd never met. The handwriting was neat, the paper slightly wrinkled from tears. "I read about your son," the letter began. "I lost my daughter 20 years ago and never found out what happened. For the first time, your story gave me peace. It reminded me that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. Thank you for sharing him with the world." Linda held the letter to her heart and whispered softly, "Thank you." It was moments like that which made her realize Ethan's story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever waited, hoped and loved without answers. Years later, when the town decided to restore its old library, they built a small children's reading area in memory of Ethan. A mural was painted on the wall, a field under a bright blue sky, a little boy hiding behind a tree, smiling. Beneath it, in gentle lettering, were the words, "Some games never end. They just wait to be found." At the opening ceremony, Linda stood quietly in the corner watching as children ran around the room, their laughter echoing softly. Jake stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "He would have loved this," Jake said. "Yes," she replied, her eyes warm with pride. "He always loved stories." That night, after everyone had left, Linda returned home and sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool and the stars above were bright and endless. She thought about how far they had come, from nights filled with fear and sorrow to evenings like this, filled with quiet peace. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You're home now, sweetheart. Life continued to move gently forward. Birthdays, holidays, family dinners, they all carried a lighter tone. The shadow that had hovered for so long had lifted, replaced by light and laughter. Jake's children grew older, and every year on Ethan's birthday the family gathered at the farmhouse. They would bring flowers, share food, and tell stories about the boy who once played hide and seek and became a part of all their lives forever. One year, Jake's daughter, who had just turned 16, stood beside the plaque and said something that stayed with everyone there. "I never met him," she said, "but I feel like I know him. He's the reason our family loves so deeply. He's the reason we don't take each other for granted. He taught us something without even being here." Linda wiped a tear from her cheek and nodded. "That's exactly right." As she looked around at her family, children, grandchildren, cousins, she realized that Ethan's short life had rippled through generations. His story had changed them all. It had taught them about love, patience, and the importance of never giving up hope, no matter how many years pass. In her later years, Linda began writing letters to Ethan, not sad letters, but ones filled with the little moments of her days, the blooming of her garden, the way the birds sang in the morning, the laughter of Jake's kids when they visited. She kept them all in a small wooden box on her nightstand. "I know you can't read them," she would say softly as she tucked each one away, "but I think you already know everything in them." One spring morning, Jake came to visit her as he often did. He found her sitting in her favorite chair, looking out the window at the garden. She smiled when she saw him. "It's a beautiful day," she said. "It is," he replied. "I thought we could go out to the farmhouse later. The flowers are starting to bloom around the plaque." She nodded. "I'd like that." When they arrived that afternoon, the field was full of life. Wildflowers swaying, butterflies fluttering, and the sound of children playing in the distance. The wind carried the scent of grass and sunlight. Linda stood quietly by the plaque, her eyes soft but shining. She placed a fresh bunch of daisies beside it and whispered, "You're still bringing people together, my boy." Jake watched her, his heart full. "He always will," he said. The years continued to pass, and though time slowly took its course, the story of the boy who went missing during a game of hide and seek remained alive, not as a tale of tragedy, but as one of love, faith, and the human heart's incredible ability to heal. Even after Linda passed away peacefully in her sleep years later, the farmhouse still stood strong and warm. Families who lived there afterward kept the plaque and garden exactly as they were. They said the place carried a kind of peace that couldn't be explained, only felt. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, neighbors swore they could hear the faint laughter of a child carried on the wind, soft and happy, like the echo of a game still being played, and maybe, in some way it was, because love doesn't fade with time. It stays in the walls of old homes, in the roots of trees, in the hearts of those who remember. Ethan's story became part of the land itself, a reminder that even when life takes away what we love most, it can still give back in ways we never expect. The Miller family's story ended not with loss, but with peace. And in that peace there was life, a life that went on, gentle and full, just as Ethan would have wanted.